June 1944. The United States Army lands on the beaches of Normandy. It is, without exaggeration, the most technologically advanced and logistically powerful military force the human race has ever assembled. We brought 50,000 vehicles. We brought thousands of Sherman tanks. We brought the most sophisticated artillery fire control systems in the world. We had absolute air superiority. The Pentagon had spent billions of dollars to build a war machine capable of crushing the Third Reich flat. And yet, less than 2 weeks after D-Day, this unstoppable juggernaut came to a screeching, humiliating halt. The entire invasion of Europe stopped dead. Was it a new Nazi suit? Was it a secret battalion of Tiger II tanks? Was it a nerve gas attack? No. It was a bush, the Bocage, the ancient hedgerows of Normandy. For 6 bloody weeks, the U.S. Army bled to death in these fields. We were gaining ground, measured in yards, not miles. The generals were panicked. General Omar Bradley was staring at a stalemate that could lose the war. The engineers were stumped. The geniuses in Washington had no solution. The greatest army in history was being defeated by French gardening, while the generals were arguing over maps in shadows. A 19-year-old sergeant from New Jersey named Curtis Culin was standing in a muddy field, looking at a pile of Nazi scrap metal. He didn't have a PhD in physics. He didn't have a defense budget. He didn't even have permission, but he had a welding torch, a hillbilly friend with a crazy idea, and enough frustration to fuel a battleship. Hi, I'm Ray. History is often written by the guys with stars on their shoulders, but battles are won by the guys with grease under their fingernails and disobedience in their hearts. Today, on G.I.Stories, we are telling the incredible true story of how a sergeant used Hitler's own beach defenses to fix a fatal flaw in the American tank, and how he saved the invasion of France with a piece of rusted junk. Chapter 1. The Green Hell. To understand why this invention was so important and why the situation was so desperate to have to understand the geography of the nightmare known as the Bocage. When Allied planners looked at aerial reconnaissance photos of Normandy before the invasion, they saw green squares. They thought, oh, look, hedges. Just like English gardens, we can drive right through them. They were dead wrong. These weren't bushes. These were fortifications built by the Romans and the Celts 2,000 years ago. Over centuries, French farmers had piled stones and dirt to mark their property lines. Nature took over. Massive trees grew out of these mounds. Their roots twisted together, binding the rocks and clay into a substance that was, effectively, reinforced concrete. Some of these walls were 6 feet high and 5 feet thick, and they surrounded every tiny field, creating a checkerboard of thousands of enclosed fortresses. The Germans, being masters of defensive warfare, realized immediately that this was the perfect killing ground. They didn't need to build bunkers. The bunkers were already there. They placed machine guns in the corners of the fields to create crossfire. They pre-sighted their mortars. On the center of the fields, when American infantry climbed over a hedge, they were instantly pinned down and slaughtered in the open field known as the kill zone. Bring up the tanks? You might say, that's what tanks are for, right? Breaking lines. Well, that was the problem. When a 30-ton Sherman tank tried to cross a 6-foot hedgerow, it couldn't just smash through. The wall was too thick. The tank had to climb up the wall. As the tank climbed, its nose went up into the air at a 45-degree angle. At that terrifying moment, 2 things happened. First, the tank's guns were pointing helplessly at the sky. They couldn't shoot the enemy right in front of them. Second, the tank's belly. The floor of the tank, which had the thinnest armor, was exposed to the German side. German anti-tank teams would wait patiently behind the hedge. They would watch the Sherman struggle up the wall like a clumsy turtle. And the moment the belly was exposed, boom, a single Panzerfaust rocket would rip through the floor, detonating the fuel and ammo inside. It was a turkey shoot. American tank crews were burning to death by the hundreds. The psychological toll was immense. Tankers started refusing to cross the hedges. The entire U.S. offensive ground to a halt. Chapter 2. The Failed Experiments. General Omar Bradley, the commander of the First Army, was staring at a catastrophe. He was under immense pressure from Eisenhower and Churchill. The British were stuck at Cannes. The Americans were stuck in the hedgerows. Desperation breeds strange ideas. First, they tried equipping tanks with bulldozer blades. It worked, technically. A dozer could cut a gap, but there was a problem. The army only had a few bulldozer blades, and the hydraulic mechanisms were slow. While the dozer was working, the Germans would just shoot the tank or the exposed hydraulic lines. It was too slow for a combat assault. Next, they tried the dynamite solution. Squads of engineers would run up to the hedge, drill holes in the earth under fire, stuff them with 50 pounds of TNT, and blow a gap. The problem, it took time. It was suicidal for the engineers, and the explosion was a giant dinner bell telling every German in a 5-mile radius. Hey, the Americans are coming through right here. By the time the smoke cleared and the tanks moved up, the Germans had an 88mm anti-tank gun aimed exactly at the hole. The mood in the American camps was dark. The morale was plummeting. The GIs felt like their leaders had sent them into a trap with the wrong equipment. They were right. The solution wasn't going to come from a general. It was going to come from the guys who were tired of dying. Chapter 3. The Hillbilly and the Sergeant. Let's go to the night of July 12, 1944. The 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the 2nd Armored Division was resting near These guys were the eyes and ears of the army. They had seen too many Shermans burning. They were sitting around, smoking, drinking bad coffee, and bitching about the hedgerows. The conversation was circular. We can't go over them. We can't go around them. We can't blow them up. Then, a soldier named Roberts, a private from Tennessee, whom everyone called a hillbilly, spat tobacco juice on the ground and said something that sounded stupid. Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges, just like a saw-through would? Most of the unit laughed. Go back to sleep, Roberts. This isn't a lumber mill. You can't put a saw on a 30-ton tank. But Sergeant Curtis Culin didn't laugh. Culin was 29. He was from Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he worked in transportation. He had a mechanic's brain. He visualized what Roberts said. Culin realized Roberts wasn't talking about a literal saw. He was talking about focusing the force. The problem with the Sherman was that its front was smooth and sloped. When it hit the wall, it slid up. But what if the front had teeth? What if it had tusks? If you put large metal prongs on the front, they would dig into the base of the wall on impact. Instead of sliding up, the tank would be anchored to the ground. The momentum of the 400 horsepower engine would force the tank through the dirt, carrying the brush with it. Culin stood up. He grabbed Roberts. Come with me. They went to see Captain James Dupuy, the maintenance officer. Dupuy listened. He didn't laugh either. He said, "Let's try it. But where are we going to get steel strong enough to cut through petrified roots?" I love this part of the story. It shows the fundamental difference between the American army and the German army. The German army was rigid. Orders came from the top. Innovation was slow. The American army was chaotic, messy, but incredibly adaptable. If a private had a good idea, a sergeant might listen. If you believe that American ingenuity won the war, do me a favor and smash the like button. It helps us tell more stories about the unsung heroes like Curtis Culin. Now, let's see where they found the metal. Chapter 4. Irony in Steel. Culin needed steel. High-tensa, hardened steel. He remembered the invasion beaches. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent 2 years building the Atlantic Wall. He had littered the French beaches with thousands of Czech hedgehogs. These were massive beams of industrial steel, welded together to rip the bottoms out of Allied landing craft. Culin sent his men to the beach with a truck and a winch. Go steal Rommel's steel. The irony is absolutely perfect. The very obstacles the Nazis put there to stop the invasion were about to become the key to the breakout. Culin's team dragged the heavy beams back to the maintenance field. They fired up the acetylene torches. They worked through the night. It wasn't precision engineering. It was brute force. They cut the beams into sharp, ungled prongs. They looked like giant tusks or horns. First, they welded them to a light Stewart tank for a test. It worked perfectly. Then, they got serious. They welded a larger, heavier set to the front transmission cover of a Sherman M4. It looked ugly. It looked medieval. It looked like a battering ram from a nightmare. They called it the Rhino. Chapter 5. The general's gamble word traveled fast up the chain of command. General Walter Bedell Smith showed up. Then, the big boss himself, General Omar Bradley. Bradley was skeptical but desperate. He drove down on July 14th, best day to see this hillbilly invention. Imagine the pressure on Sergeant Curtis. He's standing there, covered in grease, facing one of the most powerful men in the world. If this tank gets stuck, Culin is going to look like an idiot. Culin signaled to the driver. The Sherman engine roared to life. The driver gunned it. The tank hit 15 miles per hour. It headed straight for a massive hedgerow, one of those 6-foot monsters that had stopped the army for weeks. The officers flinched. They expected the tank to climb, expose its belly, and get stuck. Crash. The Rhino prongs bit into the base of the wall. The tank didn't rise an inch. It stayed flat. With a terrifying sound of tearing roots and snapping wood, the Sherman plowed straight through the earth. It emerged on the other side in seconds, carrying a ton of dirt and bush on its nose. Guns level, ready to kill. General Bradley stood there, mouth open. He turned to his aides and reportedly said, "It looks like the hedgerow just exploded to make way for the tank." He looked at Culin. There were no more questions. Bradley issued an immediate order. "I want this device on every tank in the First Army. And I want it done before Operation Cobra launches." Operation Cobra was scheduled for July 25th. They had roughly 1 week. It became a frantic race. Ordnance teams descended on the beaches like locusts, cutting up every German obstacle they could find. Field workshops ran 24 hours a day. Welding torches glowed in the night all across Normandy. In total secrecy, 500 tanks were fitted with the Rhino device in 7 days. It was a miracle of logistics. Chapter 6. Operation Cobra, July 25, 1944. The morning of Operation Cobra. The Germans were waiting. They were dug into their hedgerows. Confident. They knew the Americans couldn't cross the fields without exposing their bellies. They had their Panzerfausts ready. At H-hour, the engines started. But this time the tanks didn't go to the roads. They went to the walls. All along the front, hundreds of Rhino tanks smashed through the hedgerows simultaneously. Imagine the terror of the German defenders. 1 minute, you are safe behind a wall of earth. The next minute, a 30-ton monster bursts through the wall right next to you. Spitting machine gun fire, the German defense collapsed. They had no counter-tactic for this. The Rhinos allowed the U.S. armor to move cross-country, bypassing the trapped roads and ambushing the enemy. They sliced through the German lines like a hot knife through butter. Within days, the stalemate was broken. General Patton's Third Army poured through the gap. The Allies were finally racing toward Paris. Chapter 7. The unsung price Curtis Culin became a celebrity. He was awarded the Legion of Merit. Newspapers back home called him the sergeant who saved the invasion. But Culin, true to his character, refused to take full credit. Every time a reporter interviewed him, he said, "It was Robert's idea. The hillbilly from Tennessee. I just welded it." But history remembers the man who builds the prototype. Sadly, war is rarely kind to its heroes. 4 months later, in November 1944, Culin was fighting in the Hurtgård Frozen, meat grinder, of a battle near the German border. He wasn't in a tank, he was on foot. He stepped on a German landmine. The explosion took his leg. The man who gave the U.S. Army its legs, who allowed it to move across France, lost his own. He survived, but his war was over. He was sent home, maimed, to a quiet life in New Jersey. He became a salesman. He raised a family. He died in 1963 at the young age of 48. He never got rich from his invention. He never asked for royalties. He just did his job because he wanted his friends to survive. Conclusion today: there are only a few Sherman tanks left in museums that still bear the Rhino tusks. If you ever see one, look closely at the welds. They are rough, they are ugly. They aren't factory-made. They were made by tired, desperate men in a muddy field in 1944. Those rusted pieces of metal tell a story greater than any general's memoir. They tell us that the greatest weapon in the U.S. arsenal wasn't the atomic bomb, or the aircraft carrier, or the massive budget. It was the ability of a free-thinking American sergeant to look at a deadly problem, look at a pile of enemy junk, and say, "I can fix that." What do you think? Historians say the Rhino tank shortened the war by months. Should Curtis Culin have received more than just a Legion of Merit? Maybe a statue? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to G.I. Stories. Keep welding.